Yohan, welcome to Advocata Studios.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. And we are recording this at a crucial time. I mean, we are recording this on the 28th of July. We are supposed to get some notification on the new tariff structure by 1st of August. So by the time you watch this video, there may be a deal, there may not be a deal. But thank you, Johan, again for joining Advocata conversation and the studio. Just to understand what is the situation or the status, how do you see on the point of view of the joint Apparel Association Forum, what is up? We'll discuss about also about JAAF in a bit, but I first wanted to straight jump to the point.
Sure.
What is the situation as we speak now?
So, thank you, Dhananath, and thank you for asking me. Always a pleasure. So, I think for us as the apparel export sector, and this message is what we've been saying from day one, is that there are two things that are important. One is what that tariff number is, and second, and perhaps more importantly, what the variance is between what Sri Lanka receives versus our competitor countries. And in that bucket, we would list our competitor countries for apparel as including India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, Philippines less so, but probably those five. So I think what we've always said is that, okay, where we end up as an overall number is obviously important because that's going to have an impact on the US customer, on inflation in the US, on demand in the US. And then the second point is, what's the delta between us? If you take those five or six competing countries, obviously everybody wants to sit at the bottom of that pile. Where do we end up? What's that differential? And is there a level of differential that is manageable? Is there a level beyond which we just have to throw our hands up in the air and say there is no way we can close it? So I think what is the context is obviously that, when the 10% came in, a number of brands, I don't think I can say all brands, but a number of US brands reached out to manufacturers and said, look, there's an additional 10%. This needs to be shared by you. Some gave two, some gave three, some gave five, some gave more. So that any room that there was for giving has already been given. And I think this next challenge, and let's assume the differential between Sri Lanka and our competitors is, let's say, 10%. There isn't 10% of FOB to be given from here. So this means either the brand is going to have to take it or they're going to have to pass it on to the consumer. And both of those things have obviously got, implications from it. If they pass it on to the consumer, it's going to hit inflation, it's going to hit demand. If they take it themselves, it's going to hit their margin. So right now, and as you say, we are at the 28th of July, we're all sitting here hoping that any minute now we will have some finality. Because until this is finalized and there is some level of clarity as to where we are, we live in this sort of uncertain world where brands are not committing or committing only as little as they want to commit. So there's this great uncertainty that's hanging over our heads. People don't know, can they sell capacity somewhere else? It's this state of uncertainty has been hanging over ever since the 2nd of April thing. And we'll be at the 2nd of August now. So you've had April, May, June, July. You've had four going into five. You need to have 5 months of complete uncertainty, and that's just not good for business. It's not good for employees. It's not good for companies. So there's a piece that says, let's just get to the end of this. But will August 1st be the end? I don't think so. I think this is going to be a conversation that's going to be an ongoing conversation, particularly when you look at some of the conditions that are in these. I mean, then none of them are agreements, so there's no clarity on. But when you talk of the things that are being mentioned, you've got to wonder whether countries can deliver in on these promises.
Yeah, just wanted to, for our viewers and the audience, they may not sometimes really know the specific details about the structure as well. I just wanted to understand first. Now, this already there's a 10% tariff. So, are we? I mean, people sometimes think we are already exporting to the US as duty free, with 10% on top of the existing tariff structure, or is it in total for the tariff structure, and also give a color of like what is the variance of the apparel
Duties.
sector export duties to the
Sure.
US?
So let's talk of sort of three scenarios. One is pre-August, pre-April 2nd. And the second is between the 2nd of April and today, and then the third is the beyond. So prior to 2nd of April, when this announcement of Liberation Day tariffs came, Sri Lanka, like all of these other countries that I mentioned, all competed on an even basis. Nobody had preferential market access, so everybody paid the duty that you would be payable on that product, what's called an MFN duty. So that's determined by product. It on apparel it varies. It can be as low as I think about 6 or maybe even less than 6%, up to 35%. So the duty on a product depends on its own HS code, and the US has a very complex way of defining it. And for each HS code, there is a particular duty. So let's say a T-shirt was 15% duty. So up until the 2nd of April, everybody paid 15% duty.
So regardless, it is coming from Indonesia or Bangladesh or India,
Absolutely.
everyone were in a
Everyone
level
paid the
playing field.
duty. Yeah. So if a particular product was classified as 15, everybody paid 15. If it was classified as 25, everybody paid 25. Then what happened was he had this whole thing about the tariffs coming on, and then they said, okay, from the 5th of April, I think it was, everybody would get a 10%. So that 10% came on top of this. I think the exceptions here is China, because I think China had its fentanyl tariffs and its Section 301. I think the tariff on China is very complicated. So we have to kind of take China out for this purpose of this conversation. But if you took Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, India, everybody was getting the MFN duty plus an additional 10%. So if a T-shirt had a 7.5% duty prior to the 2nd of April, that went up to 7.5 plus 10, 17.5. And now what's going to happen from the 1st of August is that 10 number will change. So what will it change to? In Vietnam's case, we believe it'll change to 20. In Philippines, we believe it'll change to 19. For Sri Lanka, unless something happens in the next however many hours we have, it will change from 10 to 30. So post the 1st of August, everybody will then have pay the MFN duty rate and a country specific duty rate. And it is that country specific duty rate and the spread of that is of what is of importance to us.
Thanks, Johan. That I think that clears all the dust. Everyone now understand how this works. Also, the second question again for the clarification purposes. Now, when the apparel exporter is selling a product to your buyer, let's say probably the market price in New York or wherever, maybe it's a 10% garment, but what you are selling from here to the buyer is probably for a lesser price, and people get confused whether this is a price, the price increase would be actually on that 10%, or whether is the price increment from what you sell from here to the buyer. Also there's then the conversation, okay, in that case the increment would be very small, so
Sure.
why we worry so much about the small increment, because the US people will not uh,
Great.
consider like a 10% garment, a $10 garment will go to like $10 13 dollars. So what's the big deal, is the question. So could you clarify on that
Sure.
as well?
So if you take a product that's say exported from here at what we call an FOB, so when we agree a price with a customer, we would agree that price FOB or FCA out of Sri Lanka. So that let's say a garment is $5 for argument's sake. It's very likely that what the price the customer will pay is probably maybe 3x that, 4x that. So let's call it $20 for argument's sake. It's not going to be too far off. So you have two prices. You have the $5 price, which is the FOB price out of Sri Lanka, and you have the $20 price, which is the retail ticket price. Now, in terms of the duty is applied on the FOB value. So let's take that $5 garment, and then you said you have apart from the MFN tariff, you have an additional 10%. So 10% of $5, 50 cents is the additional tariff that's payable. Now, two things we need to look at. Yes, in the scheme of a $20 garment that is selling on the retail price for $20, you could argue that 50 cents is not significant. And these are the sorts of numbers you're talking, because that variance is there. Obviously, there are a lot of costs in between the $5 and the $20 point. And the point is that apparel in general is a high volume, low margin business. So when the brand was to say to the to the manufacturer here, hey guy, you know this extra 50 cents that I'm going to have to pay, you're going to have to pay half of it. It's a massive impact to the brand, to the, I beg your pardon, to the manufacturer here, because in that $5 price, there's not a lot. Yes, there's an element of profit. That's why the manufacturer is in business. But if you look at, and there are, a couple of public quoted companies, you can see, the margin on apparel is low single digit numbers. So there isn't the space. Can it all just be passed straight on to the customer? Theoretically, yes. In Sri Lanka, this Temuin's case where this whole duty. So yeah, so theoretically, the supplier can pass the entire duty onto the end customer, and arguably on a high value item, it's not much, but the market is also very price sensitive. And anything that you do in the market, yes, it's only a small percentage, it's still an increased cost, and it's still something that I think customers will push back against. They'll say, well, why is this brand raising its price by so much? So yeah, in theory you could just say, look, it's a small number, it'll get passed on. But I think the danger in that is the brand will still want to buy it at the cheapest price. So let's say the differential between Sri Lanka at 30 and in Vietnam at 20, there's a 10% on the FOB. So the buyer will still say, well, I'd much rather buy it from Vietnam because it's only an additional 20. Whether I pass that on to the customer, whether I take it, whether the manufacturer takes it, we can debate that. But the irony is a small amount at that bottom is still a significant number in the overall scheme of things, particularly to the view of the customer. So the customer will rebel against it. And we've seen this. I think some of the online stores were showing this additional amount, and you could see the reaction from customers saying, well, I don't want to pay, an extra cent, an extra 5 cents on something. So unfortunately, the customer will still push back on it.
Yeah, and also people may also be confusing. Okay, you are selling it at like $5, just as an example, but you said it's actually the retail level. It will be at about $15 or $20. So there are other costs that is from garment from here from Colombo port to the store in New York or wherever. So what are the other cost components? Because people may think, okay, they are keeping like a super profit, so there
Sure.
is a higher chance that the brand will absorb it and keep either the label price as it is, or what are the cost components?
So if you look at it, it's quite a long chain. So that cost is usually sort of at the point we would hand over to the buyers forward. So the buyer will have a consolidation center here. They'll take the goods over, they'll store them, they will arrange to ship it. You'll obviously have the cost of freight, carrying it halfway across the world. You'll have costs of warehousing, costs of distribution, and then even the costs of advertising. Big brands advertise. Where do brands get the money to do what they do for advertising, for everything? They get it in that differential between in our hypothetical instance, between the $5 and the $20. So right through, including maintaining of their offices, the whole chain. Plus, we also have to accept that in a number of cases, they're not going to sell 100% of the stock at that $20 price. That's why you have Black Friday sales, you have Thanksgiving sales, you have all these things. So there's an element they have to discount as well. That obviously will vary from brand to brand, product to product. You have to build that in. You have to build the cost of returns. You have to, there's a large portion of activities that happens. Do the brands make money at the end of it? I guess they do. I'm sure they do. Otherwise they wouldn't be in business if they didn't. But it's not like they're making 20%, 30% profit margins. So I think that entire production, the storage in Sri Lanka, the freight, the distribution, internal transfers, everything we ship to the US will go to one port. The US is a massive location. You then have to move stock from wherever that port is to your distribution centers. You have to send it from your distribution centers to your stores. So there's a really long chain of expenses that happen, including, of course, everybody in that chain has to make profit. the freight company has to, the trucking guys have to, so there is an element of profit in it. But the thing is that if you try to isolate any single element, then this becomes a large element in that. So that's
Absolutely.
where the challenge
And also,
is.
I think we need to understand it's not, this tariff is not only applicable for garments or apparels. US has increased tariffs across the board. So basically, all the prices across all the goods that they import will go up. So
Absolutely. And if you look at how dependent the US is on Chinese product, whether that's, as you say, it's not just apparel, it's food, it's clothing, it's
everything.
everything you can think of that the US customer spends money on. A lot of that has an imported content, and tariffs have gone up on as you say, everything. So the impact to the customer is going to be huge.
And also understanding from that $5 to $15 or $20, as you know, the real estate prices or the rent prices in US is quite high, and at the same time they get celebrities, I mean globally renowned celebrities, and of course their stores are at like premium locations, not locally but globally, so which incurs a massive cost
Yeah.
to maintain that brand image as well as for advertising. So that's why if you wonder like how $5 became like $15 or $20, all those costs has to be absorbed, and that's why it's a low margin, high volume business. You have to sell the number of pieces in millions to get that profit in this case. Also, then the next question, I'm just at the first phase, I'm trying to understand so then our viewers know when we get to the solutions or to understand the impact, so then they understand. So the next question is, why can't we ship this, can you forget about the US market and probably pivot to UK and the European Union or any other markets? Why is it difficult to do that?
So I think the reason it's difficult is because of the sheer volume. So if you look at Sri Lanka's apparel exports, we ship roughly 40% to the EU. I think about 35% to the, I beg your pardon, start again. We ship about 40% to the US. We then ship about 30%, I think, to the EU, about 15% to the UK, and the rest to everywhere else. So, and actually with the US, it's bigger than the 40%, because if you take a US brand that's manufacturing a t-shirt in Sri Lanka, and that's being sold in their warehouse, in their store in China or in Japan or in Australia, in a number of cases, that product goes from Sri Lanka direct to that location. So the size of our US business is actually bigger than the 40%. It's probably closer to 50%, because those
Oh.
brands are buying, 40% is shipped to the US, but everything that is shipped, you know, east of us is shipped directly. Everything, a US brand that is shipping to Europe, that will go from Sri Lanka to Europe. It won't go to the US and get reshipped from there. So that actual number I would guess it's probably closer to 50%.
So if you lose the order, basically we are losing
You
not
actually lose more than that.
more
Yeah,
than that.
more than the US order, because you'll lose the order to China, to Hong Kong, to wherever. So in that context, that size of market, so just in terms of numbers, if you say apparel is 5 billion, about 2 billion is to the US. So yeah, it's significant. The other challenge, and this is the reason the US is as big as is, apart from the actual size of it, is, as I mentioned earlier, we into the US, with a lot of those competing countries, we compete on even terms. If nobody had free trade benefits, or nothing significant anyway. So you competed shoulder to shoulder. If you take the EU, the UK, yes, Sri Lanka does have those countries have some schemes that Sri Lanka benefits from, but right now, as it stands, countries like Bangladesh have much better access. So to give you an example, if a garment is made out of fabric if the garment is made in Bangladesh, it doesn't matter where the fabric comes from, the garment is duty free into the EU. If the garment is made in Sri Lanka, it matters very much where the fabric comes from. So even in those markets, we don't compete evenly. If you look in other areas, you look at Japan, you look at Australia, in all of these countries, our competitor countries have some sort of free trade, some sort of market access. So, A, we can't pivot because the markets just don't have the size, and B, even to say fine, an X percentage of ours we can go up, that won't work, because if we can't compete evenly with our competitor countries, we're back to the same problem. I mean, and this is why other countries have a bigger presence in those markets, because they have better market access. So that same argument is going to apply. So if, for example, Vietnam is 20%, that 10% differential is just going to wipe us out. You'll also have the issue that you're going to have is that, like Sri Lanka, there will be other countries who may be at our level or higher. And here you probably put China into that pot as well. They will also pivot into those countries. So, if China stops, cuts its apparel into the US, you can bet they're going to look to ship more into the EU, into the UK, into the other markets. So the fact is that pie is suddenly going to get smaller because that American piece, taking that out, you can't just replace it. Nobody has that size of market. Every other country is going to be looking to do the same. A number of other countries already have better market access into those countries. So, you might be able to score some wins here and there, but is it going to change the needle? Not unfortunately, not.
So from that, Johan, is it reasonable to assume actually, while the tariff rate is important, that the delta can actually create more winners, like countries like Vietnam can emerge as total winners? Because in case, okay, US has a demand which will to an extent contract, but with that 10% margin, actually overall what is shifting out from China, whether some countries may emerge as a overall shifting some orders from here or Bangladesh to US, is it a feasible scenario, or is it too much of optimism?
You touched on the needle, right? It's this delta. What is the delta that is going to be there, and that is going to drive? And this is why one of the good things as the tariffs have kind of like moved, if you look at where it started, is that the average tariff number is coming down, and that is good because that is going to have less of an impact on market demand. But as you absolutely said, it is that delta that's going to determine where it goes. And the thing about, and we use Vietnam as an example, the thing about Vietnam is that it's already an established source. Some of the biggest brands source as much as 30% of their product from Vietnam. They source probably 3-4% from Sri Lanka. So to make that switch is going to be so easy. It's a no-brainer. That tariff differential. The moment if the tariff differential is 2-3%, you could probably live with that. There would be some tightening of belts that you could do. That'd be something you could do. But I think once you start getting to 5 and certainly beyond, then unfortunately that's just going to change. That's just going to move business away. And this is where the size of Sri Lanka is important, because the apparel industry, yes, it's the biggest industry in our market, but on the global scale, it's tiny. So, Sri Lanka is, depending on how you draw the numbers, between 1 and 2% of global trade. So for a brand to source what they're buying from Sri Lanka from another country is very easy because it's not a huge volume. The reverse isn't true. Let's take Vietnam. Let's say Vietnam was 50% and Sri Lanka was 0. Yes, we'd grow, but Sri Lanka can't take all of that business in. Sri Lanka has its own limitations in where we can grow. So unfortunately, even at a 50% tariff on Vietnam, companies would still have to buy from Vietnam because they can't get it from somewhere else. Sadly, the size of our business in Sri Lanka is such that for brands, they can get it from somewhere. And there will be plenty of countries who would be eager to have a crack at that, and look at taking it over. So it is disadvantageous to us in that respect, unfortunately.
Thanks, Johan. I think that's a quite a fresh insight, because people think, okay, whether what's the delta and whether we can get an advantage. But I think Johan clarified it very nicely. Also, Johan, now some may ask, now apparel industry has been there for decades. Isn't there even like sometimes, when you trade with the same manufacturer, there's an emotional bonding. Like, okay, I really cannot take it out from Sri Lanka because I have been dealing with these guys for so
Sure.
long. Isn't it a factor? So do you still think they will actually move, or how do you evaluate at least that? Because Sri Lankans are quite emotional at the same
Sure.
time. They always think, no, 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 we are doing this for a long time. No, no, this won't happen. These two shall pass. So how do you see it?
So you're right, and there is, and I think one of the biggest examples of that was during COVID, because during COVID, none of the brands cut Sri Lanka, or you had a number of other countries saying, oh, the brand has just cancelled, the brand has left us with these liabilities, this sort of thing. You never saw that in Sri Lanka.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason we didn't see that is because that relationship is there with brands. And you're correct. Some of the brands are heavily invested in all senses of the word. They've partnered with factories here, they've built development centers, they've worked with them over the years. So there is a certain amount of flex that you can give. But the market is a brutal market, and you might, the best that might do is you might be given some time, because they will sit you down and say, okay, guys, again, let's take, there's a 10% price differential on this garment. That's a price. You're going to have to do something. Fine. We'll give, because of the relationship, we'll give you a season to work it out, go back, see where you can, see what cuts you can make, see how you can come up with something. So I think that relationship that you talk of will mean that, it won't just literally stop overnight, but it will mean, though, that you will be given that, hopefully, some time to say, look, can you see what you can work out? Can you come back to us? We want to keep this order with you. We like your company. We like all of this. We appreciate the relationship. We want to keep it, but the differential is too much. And this is where I think that delta is going to come into play. 1-2% you could easily live with. Everybody would live with that.
So I think that's a quite a important factor. So that was absolutely leading to my next question. When you look at the impact, we really do not know the numbers yet. But in case if it comes fairly about 10, I mean, if it's anything above 5 to 7% than Vietnam, um, how soon that we have to expect that impact, and what is like the magnitude of that impact? The IMF report has said it will be a 3% on exports compared to GDP.
Yeah.
That's a big number. And at the same time, economic growth wise or size of the economy, they have projected from 0.25% to 1.5%. But on the industry terms, in terms of numbers like employees or in terms of size of the market, what are the estimations, or JAAF has it done any analytics on the
So
numbers?
we've done a bit of work on this to kind of look at this, and I think the problem is that right now there are just too many variables because it's, what's the delta, what are those countries, what are the conditions that these
And they all
new,
are also
and
negotiating
exactly,
non-stop.
everybody's fine. But I think what we're saying is you're absolutely right. Certainly, the moment you go around above the 5%, you're going to start seeing business move. Um, our US business, let's say you ended up at a 7 to 10% differential. I think that would take a significant chunk of our US business out, probably 50% or so of our US business, because we still do product a lot of our product can be made in other countries. And if there is a big price differential, it will move. So I'm reluctant to put a number on the table now, because there are just too many variables. But all things being equal, if you had a 7 to 10%, it's not unlikely that you will see, as I said, probably 40-50% drop in turnover. And that has massive implications, not just for employees and the company, but the moment you come down to that size, how do you manage as a business, right? You still have your fixed costs, you still have your overheads. That's the point where it'll get really sad, and you will see particularly the smaller companies falling by the wayside, because how do you survive? If the moment you lose that sort of level of your turnover, you don't have the volume. It will vary. There are some companies who are more heavily based out of the US. There are some that are more, we have some in our membership. We have some companies that are 70-80% US business. So for somebody like that, who is a small to medium company, it's very difficult to see how they will survive. So I think you'll see this across the patch. You'll see somewhere it's a lot worse off, and somewhere it's not so bad, because they might have lesser of an exposure to the US at that individual company level.
Johan, with that also, I think it's important that we explain what's the role of the Joint Apparel Association Forum as well. And because people may be wondering, if you are new to this conversation, if you're not following this conversation for some time, okay, what is the role of Yohan, and the Joint Apparel Association Forum. And when you mentioned about the membership, like who are the members, why it is important. So would you mind giving
Sure,
us
of course.
a quick overview on what's the role of JAF, and what is the role in this process so far by
Sure.
your membership and association?
Sure. So JAAF is, we call ourselves an apex body of the industry. So we cover anything connected to the export of textile and apparels. As a body, you can kind of equate us to a sort of a trade association, if you like, but our members are actually individual trade associations. So the over the years, the industry has had multiple associations. So you have, guys who do the raw materials, you have guys who represent the buyers here, their interests, you have people who manufacture product. And what JAF does is it brings together five associations, all of whom have some element of interest in the apparel export sector. If I look at companies who are exporting textile and apparel, I would say probably 95, if not 97% of those companies are connected to JAF. Connected meaning they would be members of one of the associations that is part of JAF. And we're about 20 odd years, I think, in been around for about 20 years. And the reason we came together as a single body was exactly that, so that the industry speaks with one voice. Um, and this is important because when we are talking to, whether it's a stakeholder at government level, whether it's an international stakeholder, it's important that they just hear one voice from the industry. So you're not having, some association saying one thing, another association saying something else. So our whole agenda, our whole priorities of things we work on are all determined by the chairpersons and of those five associations. They give us the direction. We then agree on what is important at a country level. JAF has always had a country first attitude. So any problem that we look at, we say, how big is this for the country? So that gives us that kind of one voice to talk to the industry. Our role, and my role in particular, is to make sure that we service the needs of these individual associations. We understand what is important to them and their members, because somebody who is setting up a textile manufacturing plant in a remote location will have a different set of challenges to an SME who is in some other location and is struggling to get product out. So it's important for us to kind of distill these and target primarily the issues that are of national importance. So in terms of this conversation about tariffs, it's obviously one of the biggest conversations. It's ever since, actually even before 2nd of April, because we kind of saw this was coming. We've been involved in talking to our members, talking to stakeholders, trying to say, what do we do what if this happens? So even, as I said, even prior to the 2nd of April announcement, there was a group brought together with government, by the government, through with various organizations, government departments. We were involved in that conversation. And then on the 2nd or 3rd of April, when the Liberation Day announcements came, the government very quickly put together a task force to look at how we would deal with that. JAF was the only non-government entity in that conversation, and that was for two reasons. Obviously, one is apparel is a significant part of what we do, our US business. So I think of our US exports, probably 70% must be apparel. You would know better than me, but it's a significant factor. And obviously, again, because we come with that one voice where we will look at it from an industry perspective. So we've had interactions. We've been part of that committee. We've fed back into people who are involved in the negotiations. JAF has not been party to any, not been at the negotiating table. And I don't, for me, that's something which is a G2G initiative. We're there to help support. We've fed into that. We've had dialogue with them, offline, to understand, to put down our needs. What is important to the industry? What can we live with? What can we live without? How much tariff differential? What does it mean on rules of origin? What is the impacts on other markets? What are the what are brands thinking? So we can feed all of this back in. And I think our role in the kind of negotiations has been to support the government. And I have to, say the government was very prompt. The Liberation Day thing came on the morning of the 3rd of April. I think by the 5th, the first letter had gone from President of Sri Lanka to the President of the US. I think that, commitment to come to the table to say we're willing to talk, we're willing to do a deal. I think all of that has paid off up to now. That's where we are. agree we still have a long way to go, but I see JAAF's role in this is being the support. Now, we're there to make sure we give the policymakers the right view of things, we give them what is important to the industry, and then we support in terms of trying to make sure that the information they require is given on time. So I think that's kind of our role, more as a support piece.
Johan, in the thank you. So now I think our viewers understand what's the role and how Johan and his team connects to this formula. In the delta that you mentioned, few countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, to an extent Philippines. What is the role of India? Are we competing for the same products in India, or how does it work?
So India is big. India is big into the US, much bigger than us. Um, right now, the way it stands on a product to product basis, I think there's fair amount of differentiation. India tends to look at, obviously things that have a lot more. India has its own handwriting, its handwork, and so on. Um, but India is also making great strides in this. We have some of our companies have already set up in India. So India would be a big player in this. I think out of the countries that we are, should we say, most concerned about this delta, the way things stand at the moment, it's Vietnam and India. Vietnam is an immediate switch. India, again, depending on the product, is a sort of shorter to medium term switch. But India's apparel into the US, I don't have the numbers with me offhand, but it's significant. It's way bigger than ours, and it's an area which India has also identified as an area for growth. There's a lot of initiatives being given in India to help to push this agenda. So India is going to be a key player in this equation.
And also, just to understand, since you mentioned, we also aware that some of the companies, the Sri Lankan companies, have expanded to India. I think also to other parts of the world. Uh, what is our presence actually? The Sri Lankan companies in Vietnam or in Cambodia, because we are aware some companies move to Africa, Bangladesh. Even most of our apparel sector professionals were located in Bangladesh to build that industry in Bangladesh. So what are the do you have like any indication on how diversified are we? I mean, I understand the money will be basically the benefit for that country, but at least the Sri Lankan, I mean, if you have some presence regionally, at least you can manage it to at least your probability of managing it higher than without having any presence. So how do you
True.
see
So
it?
I think this is something that, as you mentioned, not all, some of the big players have been able to make this transition, and that's been important up to now for a number of reasons. One is, because of the scale of Sri Lanka, we can't offer everything that the customer wants. Because of the way trade arrangements are in place, certain countries are preferred for certain locations, and that has caused for Sri Lanka industry to look at, being. So we have companies who have a presence in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Bangladesh in a big way, as you say, in India, in Africa. And this thing has always been there for the industry, that, brands want to this sort of one-stop location. They don't want to buy this from this country, that from that country through another vendor. So what Sri Lanka has done over the years is grown into something where you kind of do your central design and product development, all of that here, and then you manufacture in the location that is the most beneficial location for that customer, for that product. And again, the US is big on this, right? So you have Agua, I know it, so you have various pockets that are important. And I think you're right in that the fallout of this is going to be different. For companies who have a footprint in other countries, it gives them some sort of flexibility that they can leverage on. For companies who don't, you don't have that flexibility. So yeah, I think the handful of bigger companies who have their footprint in other countries, that will be something to offset. But those companies have a huge footprint here as well. And I think, obviously, if that goes or if that gets scaled down, the impacts on Sri Lanka are significant. So it's one we're going to have to keep an eye on and see how things happen.
Johan, also on the now on the industry point of view, also at the same time, I mean, apparel industry went through different phases. I mean, when there was COVID, it was a big challenge on how to operate, and I think the apparel industry successfully navigated through that crisis. I think even before that, when I was a schoolboy, that was this garment without guilt concept came in on paying. There were concerns about whether are we underpaying
Work
employees,
conditions and so
work
on.
conditions, so on and so forth. That was also navigated, and in fact, we made it an opportunity in the past. And also, generally, there was a social perception that the apparel sector leaders are quite visionary, and with all for their credit, because they navigated all these difficult times quite successfully, and they went from strength to strength. With that, as usual, Sri Lankans always think this too shall pass and they will do something to turn it around. What is the conversation from your membership, and like how are they preparing as a now? Okay, let's say the worst case scenario is okay. Earlier, the worst case could have been 44. At least now, the worst case will be 30%, unless President Trump gets annoyed with something else and again if he increases the tariff. But in this 30% worst case scenario, what's the preparation from the industry?
So I think that, and the challenge is this is a global one, right? This is one that you know we it's affecting every single manufacturer, every single brand. There's nobody who is completely insulated from this. So I think the conversation, you're right, that resilience has been there, and sometimes you kind of think people say, as you said, this too shall pass, or don't worry about it, they'll find a way. I think what we have to be careful is that I think this is bigger than anything we've seen before. This is one where the impact is going to happen very quickly. Um, you know, and there's so much that's outside our control. If you take, right through the war, if you take right through the COVID crisis, right through our own economic crisis, there were a number of things that could be done locally. Working with government, working with other stakeholders, you could find solutions to offset the challenges. This one, I don't see what we can do. There isn't we're not. We know the position of the state. We know the position of the government finances. And we're not in favor. We know that subsidies don't work. They don't. So there's no tools in the toolbox here right now. What can anybody do? And I think the challenge on this one is that it's going to hit fast, and as always, it's going to hit the smaller companies first. So the smaller companies are particularly worried. I mean, literally every hour I will have a call from somebody. Have we heard? Have we heard? Where are we going to end up? My customer wants to know. My customer hasn't placed his orders as yet. He's waiting to see what's happening. So this is going to, and I said that this one is going to have winners and losers. There's no, COVID, everybody lost. Economic crisis, everybody in Sri Lanka lost. This one is going to have very clear winners and losers. And where you stand in that is all down to what's happening in Washington right now. And I think it's that sense of hopelessness. I think, this is not a problem of maybe it is our creation because we export so much to the US. But, this is not a problem that we have a solution to in our toolbox. And you're not talking of, 2%, 3%. You're not talking of, manufacturers agreeing to hold some stock because the market has turned and the brands want us to hold something. This is going to change fundamentally the way the business model works, because the US market, which, as I said, up to now we competed on an even basis, that whole fundamental changes. And as you rightly say, this is not going to be a 1st August end conversation. Countries are going to do things that please the US. Other countries are going to do things that displease the US. Each time something on that happens, there could be a move on tariffs. Now that this is on everybody's radar and everybody's agenda, Sri Lanka, as every other country, is going to see what it is they can do to make sure that they get a continuous better deal. We know that Vietnam is not happy with the 20. We know that, so therefore there is going to be this constant push to get slightly better, to do something, to get some favor with the US so you get a better deal, to buy more, to support more US companies, whatever it is. So I think this is the challenge for us. Then, as I said, there are going to be clear winners and losers. And I think that winner or loser is going to be determined by what that individual country has to offer. You look at The EU deal was signed, was announced. The Japan deal, and you can see there's a large amount of give and take. These are mature economies which have large trading volumes. There are things you can do. Sri Lanka is a small economy. There's with limits to what we can do. We have to abide by WTO rules. We have to abide by the IMF guardrails. And I don't know that even if you didn't have those things in place, that there is much we can do. So I think this is the problem. I think there's an element of helplessness. What more can we do? I mean, with the NDAs, we don't know the detail of what has been discussed and offered, but we are confident that the government has explored every single opportunity. I don't think any stone has been left unturned in this, but there are challenges to what we can do. And if you look at what Japan has promised, what the EU has promised, there are big ticket items there which we don't have to play with. So that, I think right now I think one of the statements from the US says that the small countries will all, and I read something that small countries will all end up in a 10 to 15 band. Do we end up in that? Hopefully, we'll know soon enough.
Yeah, I also wanted to understand now, I don't want to hold the minister or his statement responsible for it, but also now, since I think you mentioned, I think for people to understand, it's very important to understand the fundamental difference when you impose country-wise tariff, because earlier we were, now the entire structure, the rules of the game has changed drastically. Earlier
Yep.
everyone like had a equal tariff rate. When you are entering the US border, everyone is competing on the same price structure, and now you have just made it very, I mean, you have changed it all over, where now that delta is going to be a critical factor. In that sense, is there a global way of negotiating actually based on the HS codes? Because there may be certain products which may be a country-wise tariff may make sense with US's geopolitics, um, with the current geopolitical order. But since understanding that this is a very price-sensitive market, and how this changes again change everything, isn't it a better deal for everybody? Or is there a way that, as a from the buyer's end, that you convene the, I know, I'm not sure, I'm just imagining, I know it is how complicated it is, but to at least to on this certain sector, that you go on a HS code tariff. Okay, if you really want to make it high, you make it high, that's fine, but at least to keep it
Keep
in
it.
an equivalent manner for all the is it a reason, is it a way to look at it, or is it like just a
So I,
complete.
I I think the challenge to do it that way is okay. So let me wind it back. Firstly, I agree with you, right? Because if you look at apparel, the average tax on apparel is taxed relatively highly compared to certain other products. Apparel is also, and I think the US has also recognized this. Apparel is not something that can be made economically in the US. So you're not trying to to raise tariffs to be able to have more product made in the US. That's just not going to happen. And apparel is already taxed quite highly. And I think a number of the brands and the brand associations in the US have been highlighting to the White House that, apparel is taxed fairly heavily already. You go and add this on top, it's going to pass on to the consumer. Within those tariff bands, and as I said, we look at this, if you take tariffs in the US at product line level, it can be as low as 2 to 3%, I think, right up to 35, 36%. So in that box, there are many, many different tariffs. The problem is there are just too many to be able to deal with. The US, so just to get a little technical, you have what you call an HS code or an HTS code, which is a code for every single product, and that code at the US duty, it's at a 10-digit level. So obviously, so we have certain chapters. So 61 and 62 are the apparel chapters, and within that you have, it's then broken down by the type of product, the type of fabric that's made in it, the end use of it. So you have such a large data set that it's just not viable, short of saying, okay, our top tariff is on apparel codes is going to be X. So, this would be one way you could deal with it. So you would say, fine, the US would say, fine, we're going to do these countrywide tariffs on our apparel codes, anything over 20%, right? Or the 20% is going to be the maximum. So at MFN level, nothing is more than 20. You could do something like that. But I think the challenge is when you're trying to do, 90 trade deals with 90, whatever, 90 deals in 90 days across multiple products, there just isn't the room, the space to do all of this. And I think the logistical part of negotiating all of that, agreeing it, building it into your custom systems. So, I mean, that's a Herculean task. Even right now, I don't know how US Customs will manage on Friday morning when suddenly all of these changes are going to have to hit. So I think that challenge is there. Yeah, but
Right.
I agree with you. Notionally, that would be the sensible thing to do, because we know the US is looking to raise revenue from this. We know so bringing everything down doesn't really work. But I think something like that in an ideal world would have been the better situation to do.
But I understand the complication at the systems level at the border, because imagine like how many product categories are we talking about? It's millions. So
It's millions. It's
so
literally
it's very difficult.
as I said, even you take what to you and I would look like a standard T-shirt could have 6 different codes depending on what fabric it's made of whether it's got a certain percentage of wool, as it got a, so if it's so there's just too many variables in the mix for this.
So, Johan, is it reasonable to assume on that delta, like we have to make at least Vietnam and India? I mean, do we have to fall between a 5%
I think
variance with delta value of India and Vietnam? Is it the reasonable benchmark?
so. I think the point is today it's India and Vietnam, but we don't know who's going
Who-
to be next, right? Bangladesh might pull something out of the hat and come out at a 50. But let's do this, okay? The UK has a 10% tariff. I think that's now clear that is very
Yeah.
much the absolute
Yeah.
bottom. If you look at the big trade deals, Japan, the EU, those are all around the 15%.
15%.
So you can kind of start seeing something that's happening. And I think that the challenge for us is to be within around 2, 3, 4% of that the moment that delta goes, as I said, today it's Vietnam and India, but that could be
Indonesia or
it could be
Cambodia.
it could be Bangladesh is trying desperately. I think Bangladesh had 2 rounds of negotiations. They haven't made much progress. They've offered to buy so many Boeing aircraft, so they're doing, everybody, all of these countries are all doing whatever they can to try to put forward a valid argument. So it would be 2 to 3% of whoever is at the bottom of that pile.
Got it.
That would be our hope.
Also wanted to understand, okay, let's say we manage to get into that range of 2 to 3% of that, the least tariff receiver in this game. How does the China factor impacts? Because from the little that I know, we source a lot from China at the same time, and in particular with the Vietnamese deal, I think there was a special statement from President Trump that, okay, 20% for Vietnam, but if it comes as, I think he used the word transshipment, I think probably it is like the value addition, or like the sources has to be, if it's less than, if it's higher than 40%, then I think that's what I gathered. I'm not sure whether I got it right. How does it impact on Sri Lanka's apparel? So I mean, China, how big are they, or do we have to also look at changing our sources as well? How does it work?
So you're right. China is the biggest into the US, I think, as a country, and they're also probably our biggest raw material supplier. This word transshipment, and there's so much that's been written about it and so on. I think the devil is going to be in the detail. I mean, one of the things I do every morning is just check the US government websites to see, is there any detail behind the deal that anybody has got? Because to be honest, I think there are going to be some common themes you're going to see. But this question of transshipment, and I tend to agree with you. I think that's not transshipment in terms of bringing a finished good from country A into one country and sending that out as something else. I think that's to do with raw material sourcing, and this is going to be the challenge. You're absolutely spot on. We do probably 50% of our raw material comes from China. Now, whatever happens in that, I think we can assume will be the same for everybody. I can't see a situation where one country has one limit on raw material and another has a different one. So in a sense, there'll be a leveler there, but that could, depending on what that is, that could throw the rest of the argument just out of the walk. It could be academic by that point, because if, for example, and again, there's been talk of, if you look at even the letter that came to Sri Lanka, it's a talk of that if goods were transshipped through into Sri Lanka, the duty would be applicable on the original country. Now, what does that actually mean? I don't know. And there's a range of things that it could mean. And if it means what I think it might mean, it'll be a big problem for Sri Lanka, but it'll be a big problem for other countries as well. But of course, if you take again, if we talk of Vietnam, Vietnam has a much more advanced fabric base than Sri Lanka does. So if that same restriction came in, then arguably more than the delta difference of the delta, the difference would be the fact that they had access to raw materials, and Sri Lanka is making movement on this, but these are not things you can do overnight. Fabric mills are not easy to set up, and so that is the other problem, is that that level of detail isn't there, and this is what worries me about the 1st of August, because these are the rules. Whatever comes out now is going to be in effect for goods being cleared. There's vessels sitting outside U.S. ports right now that the duty on those products is going to is determined by this. So it's how you're going to build all of this into a system and track it and manage it. Honestly, I don't know. Um, but yeah, to come back to your original question, yes, Sri Lanka is dependent on China for its raw materials, and anything that compromises that is going to add a further challenge into the equation.
Also want to understand like how possible it is to shift the orders between the region. For an example, let's say Levi's, you touched upon it. For example, Levi's may have a certain demand in the US market, at the same time they have a certain demand in the UK market. So in that context, as a brand point of view, would they consider, okay, we have a certain demand for US, we have a certain demand for UK. Okay, for US products, Vietnam is the lowest as at now, so we'll move all the orders that is going to UK from Vietnam and park it in Sri Lanka, and we load it up everything which is going to the US in Vietnam, because price wise that makes sense, because you get a better rate when you're sending from Vietnam to US, but you get a better rate probably when you're sending from Sri Lanka to UK. Is it a feasibility, or am I
So
becoming too
no, I
optimistic?
think so. I think that is already in play, right? So
Okay.
we talked about why companies have operations in other countries. It's exactly for this reason. So use your example. Yeah, Levi's will look at the particular product and say, well, this product is best made in this location because it's going into this market, it's going into this customer, and the best rules of origin are there. So in a sense, that drives where product is placed. And you're right. If you know when we get to this end, and there will be some losers, whichever way you look at it, cut it, there are going to be some losers in this. You would then look to that to kind of say, okay, well, hang on, and this is where that relationship with the customer comes into play, to say, fine, okay, let's see what we can do. We still have access to the EU, we still have access to the UK, so Mr. Brand, can you kind of see what you can reshuffle around in your mix? Um, the problem there is that, as I said, there are very few countries that Sri Lanka can compete on the same terms as many of these other countries. That's the challenge. As I said, both into the EU and into the UK, you have a restriction on where you're using the fabric from. So if the fabric is being used and it doesn't qualify, then that argument's dead in the water. So this is the challenge. But yes, you're right. In principle, that will continue, and that drives product even today. You know, where is the end product going to be? I think certain products are much more easier split in that sense. Maybe things like jeans, where the product is less complicated, less standard, is more standardized. It becomes easier. In others, it might be slightly different. If you take lingerie, the US customer has a different handwriting to what the UK customer has or the EU customer has. Sometimes the product doesn't automatically switch. But yeah, these are all things that we will have to explore to see how we you know claw back some of the loss that will happen.
Johan, generally in a crisis in that magnitude, most of the time the governments intervene, and as a think tank, of course, we do not recommend that approach. But there are instances when there's a banking crisis, when there's automobile crisis, or when there's a manufacturing crisis, governments announce some subsidy scheme or something for looking at the greater optics of the economy, because it's not only the 300,000 or 400,000 workforce. There's a secondary economy, the transport guy, the canteen guy, the boarding houses. There's a massive impact. Is there any support that your association expect from the government, or is there a way that you can work it around? Maybe I don't know whether there's a budget relief or employee salaries, or whether there's electricity wise, whether there's of course no differential tariffs between electricity, but of course is there a way that you have been discussing, or whether the government has offered in case of in your example a higher delta or above 5-7% with the regional. How what is the expectation?
So I think our ask has been to say, actually, let's focus first on the tariff thing.
Okay.
Let's leave, we've said to our advice has been, let's open that box when it's absolutely necessary, because right now we have to accept that there's a limit of focus that people can have on what things we want to look at. We don't think it's the right thing to dilute that by going and saying, can we do this, can we do that. So our message has been, let's focus on this current crisis and we'll deal with that as and when it comes. But as JAAF, and I think you and I are both aligned on this. We don't believe in subsidies. It's not the right thing to do. Um, I think that the ask is going to be in terms of what can be done if companies have to downscale, if companies have to retrench, and here we kind of maybe draw some parallels from what happened in COVID when we came to arrangements with government to look after people. And I think that's my gut feel would be the box that we would have to look at, because as you say, EDRS is long gone in history, differential tariff rates. None of these work in the long term. And we also have the IMF guardrails within which we have
Yeah.
to work. And, as I said, we're not fans of subsidies. I'm not going to come here and say, we want, this and we want that. We know that that's a sticking plaster to something that's just going to blow up in your face in due course. And as a country, we've been there, we've done that, we've learned the lesson. So I think that's not something we're particularly looking at. If and when it comes to it, I think these are the things that we will have to look at, particularly around employee support. My second favorite topic of SVAT maybe, but we'll save those conversations for a time when it actually becomes relevant to have that. Right now, we want the focus to be on the current tariffs thing and finding a solution in the next 3 days.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, I would also like to touch upon the SVAT. But at the same time, is there anything that I did not ask, but you have a comment, or you think that our audience and the Sri Lankans should know about this game, which we could not touch upon so far?
No, I think we've covered it. I mean, as I said, the key issues are, understanding what these numbers mean, understanding, what options Sri Lanka has as a country. So I think we've covered pretty much everything in the Dhananath. I think, we've talked about all of the important factors. At the end of the day, there's things outside of this conversation. Sri Lanka has to be the competitive place to be. We
Yeah.
have to be, we have to be the place that attracts the right investment, all of that. There's all of those things. But I think in terms of the tariff conversation, I think that's clear.
Now let's come to SVAT. I think this conversation has been, since this announcement came that they're going to abolish the SVAT scheme, and there's a new scheme which we are yet to be known. Now, generally, in my knowledge, the IMF also have consultations from the industry. Wasn't it? Wasn't this discussed, or why all of a sudden that this shift, and what is the expected impact on the industry? This is like, you can get a double whammy, because at a time that you have a massive global crisis on the sector, and now you have to also keep your capital tied up without getting reclaimed. So how does it work? And didn't you express this issue with the inland revenue or at the consultations?
So we have, this has been, as you say, a topic that's been on our agenda for probably the last couple of years now, I think. And our position on this, fundamentally, our position remains the same, is that we don't believe that the SVAT system has caused leakages in the tax system. If there are, and this has been our argument from day one, which was to say, well, if there are leakages, let's prove that there have been, and B, let's find a way to make those people accountable for leakages and deal with that. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. unfortunately, it's all got bundled in this whole reform of taxation and the view that Sri Lanka has too many tax, very complicated tax system, and this I think it falls more in this administrative piece of the IMF in terms of saying we just want to have you have an easier system, it's easier to administer. But fundamentally, our position still remains the same. We don't believe that doing this will bring any additional revenue to the government. That and therefore, in principle, we don't think it was a good idea. That said, the legislation has been passed, so we have moved on from that conversation. And our discussions with all of the stakeholders now has been that it is absolutely vital that we have a digital, transparent refund mechanism in place. We've talked of things like e-invoicing, which will take away the need for manual matching of invoices, speeding the process up. Um, there are, the debates over who an eligible exporter is or not. We have some issues with those lines that have been drawn. Why should somebody have to wait up to 6 months? Why should only some people get it in 45 days? If our position is if a refund is due, it's due, whether you're a local trading company or whatever it is. If the refund is due, you need it as soon as you can get it. So I think our focus from the export sector has now been to work with the authorities to say, look, fine, if we're going to do this, let's do this, but let's have a clear a digital based refund system set up and proven to work before we pull the plug. Because our worry is that if the plug is pulled and you don't have that in place, then that will have a massive impact. Now, credit to the authorities. We've had this conversation with the government, we've had this conversation with the IMF as well. The assurance is there that before this is pulled, there will be a system in place. We're just conscious that we're now at the end of July. SVAT is due to come out, I think, the 1st of October. So the timing is of the essence. And, if you look at how much movement there has been from when this conversation started today versus what has to happen between now and the removal, it is concerning that there is just not enough time to get this sorted. So our ask has been, as it has always been, to say, if you're going to refund it, that if you're going to pull the system and go to a cash refund system, you have to make sure that there is an electronic digital system in place for refunds that has minimal human intervention. Otherwise, you will just end up in a worse position than you are. And as I say, credit to the authorities. That assurance has been given to us that will happen. There will be a system in place. As I say, we've got August and September to go now before this is all done. So timing is looking very tight.
Johan, thank you very much for joining the conversation. I'm sure we have a lot to discuss about creating a better investment environment and what other reforms that we need to do. But since we get some news on this 1st of August, and probably it will continue further, and we hope that we will get a better deal. As you mentioned, at least if we can stay in that, variance, like the range um, with our competing countries with a 5% margin, probably we would be able to contest better, compete better, and take the industry forward. Thank you very much, Johan, for joining this conversation, and wishing you all the very best at these challenging times, and also your association and the members.
Thank you, and thank you for asking us. It's been an absolute pleasure as always. Thank you for your continued support. And yeah, you're right. By the time, as you said, by the time this airs, this could have moved on. Hopefully, it would have moved on. But yeah, thank you for your support, and look forward to engaging in further conversations.
Thank you, Johan. So you can subscribe us on Advocata Institute. Also, we are available in Single as Advocata Plus and also in Tamil as Advocata Kural. You can find us on any social media platform: Instagram, WhatsApp, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube. We are available in all platforms in all three languages. We are looking forward to bring another conversation in similar scale with the next episode. See you.